I'm Gary Carter, and over the past few weeks, we've learned what it takes to launch a startup from initial concept to launch. We have a team of mentors from Silicon Beach and a team launching their startup right now to help us learn about the process. We embrace and learn from our successes and failures. Welcome to Concept to Code. Today on Concept to Code, we're going to learn how to code in PHP. Now, if you're following our startup schedule, at this stage, you're ready to code your beta site or app. So power on your laptops, we're going to code today. To help us get coding, I'm pleased to welcome our guest mentor, Vladimir Jimenez, founder of S1E5, a web development consulting company that launches and maintains interactive websites. Currently entering his junior year at Cal State Northridge as a computer science major, Vladimir taught himself how to code at 13. He enjoys teaching others how to code and contributing to open source projects. Vladimir is also a web developer at CSUN Associated Students. Vladimir, please join us. Thanks for coming today.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, great.
Today I'm going to be showing you how to build a website and how a website like Favorite would work in theory. So starting off, there are three parts to the website. There's going to be the front end, the back end, and the database. Today we're going to be focusing more on the front end and the database. So with the database, as you can see on the next slide, you can think of the database as an Excel workbook, where each workbook can have multiple sheets, and each sheet can have multiple columns and rows. So similar to that, a database has multiple tables, and each table is going to have multiple rows and multiple columns. So on the next slide, we can show you an example of how we would store user data. So we would always have a number for each user so they can be unique, a username which would be column B, then email, then name. So that's a representative example of how it would look like in Excel. So on the next slide, I'm going to show you how a user's table would actually look like using MySQL. First of all, as I mentioned, each entry is always going to have an ID. Each ID is going to be unique to that specific user. You can think of it as a social security number for that specific account or that specific entry in the database. And because this is going to be unique and it's going to be a number, we want to declare it as an integer. So short for integer is going to be int, as you can see under type. And it's going to be a length of 11, so we can have a maximum of 11 digits for this ID. Then we're going to be storing the username, email, first name, and so on, as you can see. The thing that you can notice is that there's also the varchar. Varchar can basically store anything from a character to a number to a symbol. And that's where we're going to be using to maintain pretty much everything else. And we have different lengths for each one just for sanity checks, because we don't want outrageous lengths in username or outrageous names. And then those last two entries are the join date and the last login, both of them being date time, and as the name infers, there are timestamps for when they joined and when they last logged in. So I'll show you how it looks like an example entry on the next slide. So for myself, I created an entry. I'm user number 1. My username is Ayeho, and my email's in there, and so on. So you can notice that's how we can store information about all the users. And you can notice that the password and salt are a bit confusing. They're random gibberish, as you can see. And then for the next example, also there's Gary. We have an entry for Gary on the next slide. And it follows the exact same procedure, exact same format. And there's always going to be the gibberish for the password and the salt. And on the next slide, our password example is going to be concept to code. And whenever we store passwords in a database, we always want to have them hashed. We never want to store them in plain text or encrypted, because if we do so, then that's going to be a hacker's heaven. Because then afterwards, if they steal it, then they have complete access to all your passwords. And because we're storing emails also, if the user has the same email and password for their bank account, then you're in deep trouble. So friendly reminder to always use different passwords for important accounts. So in this example, we have our password concept to code, and it has spaces and it has different lengths, and it's all lowercase. Then we have salt. Salt is going to be added to our password whenever we hash it. So basically, we can have a password and salt, as you can see, is a combination of both of them. This way, we can have a more unique hash. So as the last example, is the SHA-1 algorithm to create that hash. And the only way you can figure out what the password is for this is if you do brute force, meaning you go each possible combination possible. So A, B, C, A, B, B, C, C, and so on. And that's going to take a really long time. And if we use password in assault, then we're going to have a string that's over 50 characters long. So that's going to take a really long time to figure out. And even then, we're still going to figure out what part of it is the password. So now we're going to move on to how the locations table would look like inside of the database. In a website like Favorite, we're going to want to store the coordinates for that specific location. We're going to want to store who owns the location and the latitude and longitude for it. So in this example, like I mentioned earlier, it's going to be an ID. So again, so we can always reference that specific entry simply. So it's going to be an int. Then others is going to be the owner. The owner is going to be the ID of the person who created that favorite. And then others we're going to have names, notes, latitude, and longitude. Notice that latitude and longitude are both decimals, so we can have exact precision. So what this means with the length is 18, 14. Basically, we can have a number that's as long as 18 digits, and it can have up to 14 decimal points. So that's ideal for storing locations on a map. And I'll show you an example for the locations table and what it would look like. So we have two entries, two for me and two for Gary. First two entries are City Hall. There's a latitude and longitude locations for City Hall. And as you can see, one of them is owned by myself, which is number 1, and the other one's owned by Gary, which is number 2. Then Gary has SMC favorited, and that's going to be latitude and longitude. And then others I have a place in San Diego called Gilberto's Mexican Food, and that's, as you can see, the coordinates are much different than they are in Santa Monica. So that's how it would look like. And then after we're going to be moving on to the back end. The back end, in this case, is going to be PHP, and I'm just going to touch about it really quickly. But basically, what the PHP is the middleman between the front end and the database. So in other words, it gets information from the database and combines it with the front end and gives you a pretty website where you can log in, view your favorites, and you can change your user password and whatever you would like. So an example of what we could do to access the database would be on the next slide. Or we can access information about the user. So just recalling that as an example, we have the user entry for myself, so username and email, and everything else we don't really care about right now. But as you can see in the code, which is a bit dark right now, the ID, we're going to have ID equals number 1. What the ID is a variable. And we can tell it's a variable because of the $sign. A variable is basically a box that can store any type of information, and it can store other boxes inside of it as well. So it can store even more variables. Then after this, we're going to create another variable called DB. DB is going to be, as you can see, we're going to get access to the database. So we're going to get an instance to the connection for the database. And then afterwards, we're going to have a third variable called user. The user was where we're going to store all the information about the actual user from the database. So, and the way we communicate with the database from the back end is we use SQL queries. SQL being short for Structured Query Language. And what that looks like are basically just sentences, as you can see, where it says select asterisk from users where ID is equal to question mark. And basically all that's saying is select all of the columns from the table called users where the ID is equal to 1. So the ID equal to 1 is myself, and we want to get all of the columns for it. And then this last part is limit 1, because we just want to be sure that we only get one result, just in case there's a mix-up in the database and more than one user has the same ID, which should never happen, but always better to be safe than sorry. Then after at the very end, with the question mark, we are basically giving it a parameter, meaning we're going to give the information later. And we're giving information, in this case, right after it with the ID at the very end. And once this query executes, you're going to communicate to the database. It's going to get the information, and everything is going to be stored inside of the user variable. Then after, as you can see at the bottom over here, we're going to be able to get the username and the email from there simply by accessing them with brackets. So that's a quick example of how we would access the database and how we would use it with the front end. So moving on to the front end, what is the front end? It's basically what you see on a daily basis, what you log into, what all the login forms, the buttons, the user panel, your news feed if you're on Facebook, all of that, your timeline, all of that is the front end. And what's powering the front end is basically HTML and CSS. And as you can see on the next slide, we're going to be able to start off with Sublime Text 2. This is just one of my preferred editors. So if you would like to join along with some coding at home, then you would be more than welcome to. You can look up Sublime Text 2. It's available both on Mac and Windows. Then after this, on the next slide, you will be able to see some example code. So HTML is basically this. It's structured with beginning and end tags. Similar to literature and English, where quotes always start with a beginning quote and an end quotation mark, it's going to be similar to the same thing. It's going to be the exact same thing in HTML, where we're going to have a start tag and an end tag. And tags just look like this, where they have the greater than and less than symbols respectively around whatever the tag name is. So we're focusing on the body for right now because everything else does not matter at the moment. So right now this page has no content whatsoever, but as you can see, we're going to have different parts of it. So we have the header, then the main, and inside of the main we're going to have a section and an aside. An aside is going to be a sidebar, but right now it doesn't look much like a sidebar, so that's where CSS comes in. CSS allows us to manipulate the HTML elements inside of a website, and it will basically let us make it look pretty. So in this case, we would be able to make the aside look, actually live right next to the section without having any conflicts and without taking the entire width. So as an example from the previous one, the body is the entire page. Then afterwards, the header is just going to be the header. So the header is typically going to have the logo, the company name, maybe a search bar, and any user navigation that you want. Then afterwards, inside of the main is where your entire content is going to go on the website. So whatever you want, whether it's a timeline or a news feed or your system preferences or account preferences on Facebook. And then after this, last but not least, is always the footer, where you have copyright and some miscellaneous information. So we'll be able to see an example of how this would be structured and what CSS would be needed. So if you can go to the next slide, I'll show you what CSS is. It's basically cascading style sheets, which allows us to, as I mentioned earlier, to make HTML look pretty. And all it is just a set of rules for specific HTML blocks and HTML sections. So in this example, we have a rule for body, meaning the entire page. We're going to give it a background color of EF, 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 that being just an off-white color. And in HTML and CSS, we always reference colors via their hex values. Their hex values are just calculated with RGB values. Then after this, we're going to have a font family. So all the fonts on the website on the entire page will look similar. And we're going to stick with sans serif. Sans serif being the similar font to what I'm using on this presentation. Then after there's going to be margin 0 and padding 0, meaning just no space around it and no space inside of it. So all of our elements can go to the edge of the browser without having any issues. On the next slide, we'll see that this code would make it look how it is for the actual example. So for body, we would want to give it the light blue color. Then after the header, we'll give it the light red color. And then after this, we have a rule for border. Border being the actual border, as you can see in the header. And what that basically says is I want the border to be 1 pixel wide, and I want it to go through the entire actual area of it. And I want it to be solid. So I don't want it to be dashed, or I don't want it to be dotted or anything like that. And I'm giving it a dark color, a dark red. So similarly, I'm going to do the same thing for main, and it's going to be the background color is green and a dark green for the border. And then after this, I have the main section and the main aside. Basically, to have them live happily ever after right next to each other, I need to make sure that both elements are floated. Floated basically allows the elements to live next to another one without having to take up the entire space that is given. So with main section, I'm telling it to float to the left, and I'm only giving it a width of 75%. So it only takes up 75% of the entire page. And then after for the main aside, I'm giving it a float to the right, so it goes to the right-hand side, and it's going to take up 25% of the width. And that's going to be it for this example. So here's going to be an example of how a front page for favorites would look like, where I just wanted to say, hi, welcome, Ayeho, which is going to be my username, and then I just want to list my favorites and the locations. So to do that, inside of the section that we just created from the previous example, we would start adding new elements. H1 being the header 1, so it's going to be the text that's most important in the page. And we are basically welcoming the user. Then after this, right below it, we have the H2, which is just going to be smaller text, but it's still important. And then after this, so we're just introducing that these are all of our locations. Then after to display all of the locations, all the longitude and latitude coordinates, we're going to create a table with data. And we're going to create a table with the class called favorites. And I'll show you what the class allows us to do in just a sec. But right now we have 2 rows for this column, for this table, signified by TR. So as you can see, we have the open TR and the closed TR at the right below it. Then after this, we have TDs. TDs is table data. So it's going to be each column in it. So for this example, we have City of Santa Monica being the first column, then the latitude, and then the longitude coordinates being on the next 2 columns. And then afterwards, that's it for that row. And for the next row, we're going to have Gilberto's Mexican food, and then afterwards, once again, the coordinates for it. And now I'm going to show you what we can do once we have a class for the actual table on the next slide. As you can see, we're giving the actual table a few rules. We're giving it border collapse, so there's no space between the actual columns and rows, so they all live right next to each other. And we're using width 100%, so it takes up the entire width. Then afterwards, we're adding some rules to favorites, each table row. And then afterwards, what we want to do is have basically a border at the top and at the bottom, but then afterwards, nothing on the sides, nothing for the columns, and nothing for the rows either. So as you can see in this example, we basically have the 1 pixel solid border of a dark blue color at the bottom and at the top. And then afterwards, we have left and right being none, so we don't want anything there. Then afterwards, we have a special rule for nth child odd and nth child even, which basically allows us to alternate colors between each table row. And one color is going to be FFFF and so on, and that just means it's white. And then after the other one is DCE9F5, which is just a light blue color. And on the next slide, I'll show you what this basically creates. And it's just, as you can see, lists all my favorites locations, so latitude and longitude coordinates, and it introduces me. And that's basically how you would build a website similar to Favorite.
Vladimir, thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you for having me.
Teaching us how to code today, PHP. When we come back, we're going to meet our startup team Favorite and hear their discussion with Vladimir on coding. Stay with us.
Discover 30 years of opera in Santa Monica. Discover the Verdi Chorus.
Welcome back to Concept to Code, a show focused on giving you the skills to launch your startup. I'm your host, Gary Carter, and today we're learning about coding in PHP. Our featured startup is a company called Favorite, and the team will give us an insider's view of their launch. We're pleased to have co-founders Anka Aldenart and Andres Rodriguez of Favorite. Let's listen into their discussion with Vlad.
What type of framework is powering Favorite?
So currently we're using Parse, which is a startup that gives you a basic framework where you can put things online and call them back very easily. So it gives you kind of a database in the box and very simple libraries where you can put things on the cloud, basically. And that's a very good way to start because it allows us to build the things that we need to build very fast.
And Are there any resources that our viewers can use to start to learn how to code?
Yeah, actually, people don't realize, but there is a ton of things online. iTunes, for example, the iTunes store has most of the courses from Stanford for how to learn in Objective-C, how to learn to program in Objective-C. And they're amazing classes. There is Coursera, there is Udacity, where you can go and watch courses for free or pay a small fee if you want a certificate from each one of the classes. But there is many resources online if you want to learn how to code.
Great. And I hear that favorite, I guess you coded enough, and now it's time to, you've launched the app, is that correct?
And that is correct.
Yes, that's correct. It's in the App Store.
It's in the App Store, congratulations on that. High five.
Very good.
That's great.
Thank you.
All right, well, I think we did our job here on Concept to Code, and we're happy to hear that favorites in the App Store. I hope our viewers go ahead and take a look and download the app. And that's enough PHP coding for today. Now it's time to launch your beta site. Thank you, Vladimir Jimenez and Favorite, for the learning experience today. And thank you for joining us. We hope to see your startup next time on Concept to Code.